This is Nancy with Nancy's Classic Bedtime Stories, and tonight's read is The Red Badge of Courage by Stephan Crane. And I'm going to start tonight with the introduction because I think it's very interesting. So we'll do it in segments, but the first segment is going to be the introduction by Alfred Kazin, Kazin, Kazin. The Red Badge of Courage, published in 1895, has long been considered the first great modern novel of war by an American. Just want to make sure that it is, it's recording. The first novel of literary distinction to present war without heroics, and this is in a spirit of total irony and skepticism. Since the First World War, which disenchanted a whole generation and launched a literature about war savagery critical of conventional patriotism, it has become almost a matter of custom for writers who served in war to describe their experience with bitterness. And each war since 1914 to 1918 has intensified the personal bitterness. What makes the Red Badge of Courage so remarkable and a pioneer in the literature of war is that it was written entirely from instinct by a young newspaper man in his early 20s who had never even seen a war. Stephan Crane was to see a good deal of war after he wrote his famous book. As a correspondent for famous newspaper syndicates of the time, he was to accompany a filibustering expedition by Cubans seeking the liberation of their island from Spain. He was in Cuba reporting the Spanish-American War and in Greece for the Greco-Turkish War. It was typical of him to say, after he had seen hard fighting in Greece, "The Red Badge is all right." And since he had been charged with imitating Tolstoy in War and Peace when he wrote The Red Badge, he amusedly looked into War and Peace for the first time and typically never finished it. "It goes on and on like Texas," he complained. That's remarkable. Great stories about war usually have not only been written by veterans of war, but have depended on the blood and thunder of war, the irresistible reality of violence, to produce certain effects. Crane, in this, as in so many other things, was an iconoclast. The Red Badge of Courage deals less in external violence than in mental states. It is indeed a psychological novel as much as it is a novel of war. To understand how a relative boy who had never seen war could have come to such insight and detachment, it is necessary to know something of Stephan Crane. For the book, though a masterpiece of impersonality, is rooted in the personality of Crane himself, and through genius, William Dean Howells, Joseph Conrad, H.G. Wells, and many lesser authors instantly recognized him as a genius, is notoriously a mystery to genius itself. Crane's life and spirit are so extraordinary that they may furnish a link to the origins of the Red Badge. Crane was born in Newark, New Jersey in 1871, the 14th child of a prominent Methodist preacher and a founder of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. An ancestor had signed the Declaration of Independence. Crane liked to boast that during the American Revolution, the Cranes were pretty hot people. The children of ministers have a reputation for rebelliousness, and Crane, in his stoical and tight-lipped way, was no exception. He was a naturally sardonic observer of his kind, even when he was a boy reporter covering New Jersey summer resorts. It was characteristic of him not to take formal education seriously. Though he never finished college, he carefully stored away for literary use the impressions of human conflict that he had received on the college football field. Crane was not yet 29 when he died in Germany, 1900, after having vainly sought in the Black Forest some respite from lung disease. One of the main sources of the Red Badge may well have been Crane's early sense of death. He was to expose himself recklessly in the expeditions and wars he reported, and his famous story, The Open Boat, harrowingly turns into great literature an actual experience of shipwreck and suffering that was only one of many terrible physical inflictions that shortened his life. Crane's biographer, John Berryman, was sure that one impulse behind all Crane's writing was fear. If so, he certainly hid it in a defiant fashion. Crane, in his short life, quickly showed himself the most original, most ruthlessly independent, most sardonic novelist of his talented generation. Crane, Theodore Dreiser, and Frank Norris were born within a few months of each other. It is startling to realize that Crane would not yet have been 50 when the 1920s, in the aftermath of World War I, saw the triumph of modernism in American writing. The Red Badge of Courage was then recognized as a model for 20th century novelists obsessed with the psychology of war. In Crane's short, always tense lifetime, it somehow made an exhilarating career despite the tragedy of his personal life. He managed many different subjects with surprising ease. Of course, he did not manage himself as well as he should have, but another clue to the Red Badges, Crane's personal recklessness, his insistence on playing a tough, indifferent role. Before he died so frighteningly young that many of his friends and admirers felt that he had thrown his life away, he actually defied the New York Police Department by testifying for a prostitute arrested by corrupt policemen. Later, he defied Victorian morality by living with a woman who had operated a high-class brothel in Florida. As Mrs. Stephan Crane, which she wasn't, she accompanied him to England and to the Greco-Turkish War. This took not only courage on both their parts, but represented a deliberate refusal of the conventions. And it helps to explain the total unconventionality for its time of the Red Badge of Courage, for Crane always made a point of being different. Crane somehow brought to focus in his person, in his work, the sudden skepticism of a generation that had seen religion's authority weakened by science and conventional patriotism abandoned for American imperialism and saber-rattling in the 1890s. By the end of the century, when Crane died, America was to seem as aggressive in foreign policy as its European counterparts. Mark Twain, in his embittered old age, called this aggressiveness the Great Game. And if God was dead, as they first began to hint in the 19th century, his absence was marked by writers principally in the 1890s, the clever decade, in which Crane did all his principal work. Nowhere in American writing was a godless world expressed with so much terseness and finality as in the work of Stephan Crane. He was to write in one of his astonishingly chill, totally skeptical poems that God is cold, and he repeated this in stanza after stanza as if to assure the reader that he meant it. Like so many of the best American writers, Crane learned as a reporter to write quickly, plainly, but also to harden his style. The last thing he ever wanted was to wear his heart on his sleeve. The Red Badge, which Hemingway proclaimed to be an American classic, has an obvious influence on Hemingway's own tight-lipped style. The important thing about Crane's journalistic experience is that it opened up to him places and people from the Bowery in New York to the Balkans at war that many other Americans of good family missed. And this at a time, the 1890s, when there was more violence in the air, more war, and many more rumors of war than had been evident since the Civil War. All of this went into the Red Badge. Crane's restless temperament and his love of sensation, even more important to the Red Badge, were initially excited by the teeming mass life of immigrants on the Lower East Side of New York. In his last years, when he lived in England, he wrote to the critic James Huneker, "I told a seemingly sane man that I got my artistic education on the Bowery, and he said, 'Oh, really? So they have a school of fine arts there?'" New York, notoriously never a peaceful place, was Crane's introduction to the psychology of war. The angry class, as upper-class Americans called rebellious workers in the labor strife that erupted at the end of the century, was certainly manifest in New York. But the immigrants and their children crowded into the tenements of the Lower East Side tended to be most angry at each other, an observation Crane put into his lurid first novel, Maggie. This was a novel so shocking for its time that Crane published it under a pseudonym and at his own expense. I should read that one next. The link between Maggie and the Red Badge of Courage is Crane's recognition that the sense of a city is war. Environment is a tremendous thing in the world and frequently shapes lives regardless. He wrote inscribing Maggie to the pioneer realist Hamlin Garland. The most famous American realist of his time, William Dean Howells, significantly introduced Crane to his friends as a writer who had sprung into life fully armed. Crane's strange early associations with war were definitely marked ones, and even as a student, Crane had been fascinated by anything to do with the military. It is also significant that war had become a principal factor of history in the 1890s. The Civil War had been over for more than a generation, so that there was a tendency to romanticize it, especially in the South, in the slick fashionable fiction of the time. Nevertheless, it was plainly the central event in American history, and there were endless reminiscences of and documentary histories of the war that constituted an American Iliad. Crane was deeply influenced in his writing of the Red Badge by a famous series, Battles and Leaders of the Civil War, that first appeared in the Century magazine. Exactly what impelled him to begin the Red Badge, we do not know. It is significant of the widespread interest in the Civil War that Crane was able to first publish his novel in a Philadelphia newspaper. His attitude toward war was so cool and ambiguous that jingoes like Theodore Roosevelt, later a bitter critic of Crane's war correspondence from Cuba, were among the first admirers of the Red Badge. "War, alas, can be very exciting to men," General Robert E. Lee said. "It is well that war is so terrible, else we should grow too fond of it." War has traditionally been a surefire subject for writers. The 21-year-old Crane, who wrote the Red Badge in 10 successive nights, obviously felt inspired or compelled as a writer by the subject of war. Like his future admirer, Hemingway, Crane loved every example of the extreme in human affairs, and since he was so naturally ironic about American pieties and social convention, it may also be that in writing the Red Badge, Crane wanted to puncture some overgrown pieties about American idealism in fighting the Civil War. The 1890s were plainly forgetting that the war was not fought to emancipate the slaves, but to keep the Union together at all costs. Notice that in the book there is virtually no discussion among the Northern soldiers of the issues behind the war. They are just there to do the job of fighting and killing, and that turns out to be almost too much for them, as it is usually true in war. Notice, too, that although the great battle described in the novel is drawn from actual accounts of the fighting at Chancellorsville, May 2nd to 4th, 1863, that name is never mentioned. Similarly, Henry Fleming is usually called the Youth, and his buddy Jim Conklin is the Tall Soldier. Crane liked to hear Civil War veterans tell their stories, and he drew many significant details in his novel from the first-hand accounts in Battles and Leaders of the Civil War. But although his novel so impressed many veterans that they insisted that Crane must have been in the war himself, he had not been interested in bringing the Civil War back to life as historical fiction. I'm sorry. Leave the cat alone, dog. Sorry. Sorry. What impressed the veterans was Crane's instinctive sense of battle and his scorn for the rhetoric of war. It was psychology, not history, that drew the 21-year-old to write about war at all. Clearly, the psychology of war was deep in Crane himself, perhaps in what John Berryman insisted was Crane's fear. And just as Crane's adventurous and daredevil life may indeed have been his way of confronting this fear, so Crane was fascinated by all professions of manhood and the large place that courage plays in the inner life of men. She is going to scratch your eyes out. Leave her alone. Sorry. Whatever they were, the obscure forces in Crane's own psychology that suddenly drove him to write The Red Badge in 10 continuous nights must have resembled the unrelenting pressure of battle, the high point in the book itself. By persistently calling his protagonist the youth, Crane also wanted to demonstrate, as is natural at 21, what the initiation into war can be like for a young man. War is traditionally the ordeal of young men. It is also the most extreme example thrown up by any civilization that there are forces that youth ignorantly and tragically thinks it can control. What is most notable about the Red Badge is that this illusion of control and confidence, the real theme of the book, is always before the reader. Although the youth learns soon enough that he controls nothing, that he is just another helpless soldier under fire and becomes sick with fear until he runs away. His actual desertion is never noticed. Here is a joke, if you like, at the expense of Henry Fleming's actual cowardice, just as Henry's eventual courage will also be treated as kind of a joke. For in this book, courage is as mechanical as desertion. Henry is swept back into the battle without any will on his part. Without quite knowing where he is or what he is doing, he becomes hysterically aggressive like his comrades. Performing an act of an unintentional heroism, he seizes a Confederate flag from its falling bearer. He is acclaimed at battle's end. He is now and at last perfectly satisfied with himself. He has got through his initiation, his real battle, with his own fear. But the reader, who has been following Henry's every sensation from paragraph to paragraph, Crane's greatest feat in the book, knows that this triumph is of no real significance and that the youth's satisfaction with himself is a passing phase. War is so mad and terrible that nothing is easier for the actual participant to forget and to turn into something utterly different from the actual moments of terror and madness. Of course, not everybody reads The Red Badge this way. Critical discussion of the book centers on a fundamental disagreement. How seriously did Crane mean us to take the personality of Henry Fleming? Is it possible that for purposes of naturalistic fiction, Henry is not required to be a complex personality at all? Or is Henry a hero who disappoints, whom Crane judges critically as a violator of the heroic code? This last interpretation supposes that Crane meant Henry to be a hero. I believe, on the contrary, that in persistently calling Henry the youth, Crane indicated that he saw war as an experiment, a favorite word of Crane's, and that the youth is nothing more to Crane than the leading figure in his experiment. Note that no active soldier in the book is given any sense of personal freedom, decision, or sacrificial heroism. The subtitle of The Red Badge is An Episode of the American Civil War. Episode is another of Crane's favorite words. The scheme of this short and taut episode clearly depends on the testing of a helpless young man. He is so ignorant of the war's larger purpose and strategy that he innocently thinks he's alone in being tested. Not only is the youth never in control, he thinks that his leaders have male violently exposed him, then helplessly leaning on his comrades for some assurance, he realizes that they are as bewildered, helpless, and even furtive as he. He gets his courage, such as it is, from his sense of common doom. Crane understood that war is not an accident in human affairs, even even as accidentally as wars seem to be touched off in the rage between countries, or at least between their leaders. Terrible as war always is, men, at least in the pre-nuclear age, have often welcomed war as a test of their honor in what men have traditionally called the battle of life. Crane understood this so well that in the Red Badge he minimized the undeniable aggressiveness of men in favor of the psychological theme of man's courage. There is no better proof of how ironic and detached Crane was in pursuing this theme than in the title itself. The Red Badge of Courage turns out to be any sign of blood on oneself. It is enough for the man who suffers a wound, and it may take him out of the battle. It is a sign. Men live by signs. Reality is personal and entirely self-centered in the Red Badge, as it is in our youth. Crane does not spare his non-heroic hero, but neither is he scornful. It would be a great mistake to assume, because of Crane's detachment, that he himself is as bitter about the ravages of war as actual writer soldiers from Tolstoy to the veterans of Vietnam have usually been. The reader is not allowed to forget Crane's experiment. He was inquisitive about war and by no means sure that he knew what he was doing. After completing the book, he confessed, "I've spent 10 nights writing a story of the war on my own responsibility, but I am not sure that my facts are real, and the books won't tell me what I want to know, so I must do it all over again." I guess nothing so delighted him as the conviction held by Civil War veterans that Stephan Crane had been in the Civil War himself. I think that's brilliant, or genius. Oh, that's fun. No veteran of the Civil War could have been so coldly removed from the spirit in which Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes addressed a soldiers' reunion. Our hearts were touched with fire. Crane's heart was touched by war, as what William James called, God bless you, dear, the peculiarly exciting kind of sport. But excitement? Shall we not worship excitement? And after all, what is life for except for opportunities of excitement? The so-called excitement of writing the Red Badge of Courage lay in Crane's ability to manage his experiment in swatches of gorgeous color. He was a virtuoso of style, far from being a realist, merely far from limiting himself to the gray, bleak forces determining human behavior. Crane wanted nothing so much as to describe the moment-by-moment riot of emotions that men must especially feel when they are under fire. As Joseph Conrad said, Crane was chiefly an impressionist and only an impressionist. The only lapse in Crane's astonishingly sustained sequence of sensations is a tendency to smirk at the youth for being bewildered. Men at war tend to project their fear and excitement onto unrelated things. Crane wittily mimics this pathetic fallacy that soldiers cannot help indulging in. Tattered and eternally hungry men fire despondent powers. Guns are surely the battled flag seemed to be struggling to free itself from an agony. Men in battle do transfer their emotions to the guns, the weather, the unheeding landscape. Never, as at the end of the 19th century, did Americans come to believe that power had passed from men to their instruments. Once the great battle begins, and the youth increasingly realizes to his horror that he is on his own, the sense of entrapment becomes cruel and almost intolerable in its vividness. We come to feel utterly alone. The youth's sensations clearly speak for Crane as much as Crane does for him. Fear not only maddens Henry Fleming, it occupies him. everything else is blotted out as bullets began to whistle among the branches and nip at the trees. It was as if 1,000 axes, wee and invisible, were being wielded. Crane's detachment and irony are persistent. Though the youth is shown to have no control over his actions and runs away, he is finally able to rejoin his outfit, to have the minor head wound he received in a struggle with the retreating soldier of his own army accepted as a battle wound, to fight bravely at the side of his comrades, to seize the enemy colors in the final charge. His essential experiences are of seeing other men dying or dead. His buddy, the tall soldier, becomes the spectral soldier. When fatally wounded, the man staggers in a spasmodic dance before he falls. In the forest, where the high arching boughs made a chapel, the youth stops, horror-stricken at the sight of a thing. He was being looked at by a dead man who was seated with his back against a column-like tree. The corpse was dressed in a uniform that once had been blue, but now faded to a melancholy shade of green. The eyes staring at the youth had changed to the dull hue to be seen on the side of a dead fish. The mouth was open. Its red had changed to an appalling yellow. Over the gray skin of the face ran little ants. One was trundling some sort of a bundle along the upper lip. Every detail piled on the youth's helpless soul anticipates what Wyndham Lewis said of the Hemingway hero. He is the man things are done to, but this man is no hero. He really has no personality, no history, no career outside his reflexes. He is not only the subject of Crane's mocking inquiry, he is all too much what Crane had come to think of as the average man when caught up in a situation. But it must be remembered that Crane did call it just an episode. He was to protest that the red badge did not express his total view of things as his poems did. It is significant that he allowed the book to appear as a newspaper serial in a much abridged version in 1894. The standard version of the book, first published in 1895 by D. Appleton and Company, and the text of the present edition, does not include cuts from the original manuscript. Whether it was Crane or his editor at Appleton, Ripley Hitchcock, who made the cuts, Crane obviously did not disapprove. He proofread the Appleton edition before it appeared, and he never made any attempt to later to revise the book. Obviously, it was a psychological situation that enlisted all his attention in the book, and he felt that he had done justice to it. Control of this situation, episode, experiment, in the form of Crane's most picturesque and dominating prose, is clearly Crane's passion behind the book. If the youth is the man things are done to, Crane is the man who knows what is being done. Even when the youth felt carried along by a mob, he found no support in others, but was exhausted and ill from the monotony of his suffering. This individual caught up in the melee is credited with the acute exasperation of a pestered animal, a well-meaning crow worried by dogs. The swirling battle phantoms were choking him, stuffing their smoke robes down his parched throat. Crane's driving style alone lifts in the unnerving crescendo of battle. Totally isolated and fear-maddened youth into primitive connection with his surroundings. And Crane's language in the ecstasy of his genius takes over completely when the battle goes mad exactly halfway through the book. He became aware that the furnace roar of the battle was growing louder. The youth began to imagine that he had got into the center of the tremendous quarrel, and he could perceive no way out of it. From the mouths of the fleeing men came 1,000 wild questions, but no one made answers. Crane's grip on the youth does not relent in the final pages. When the regiment's charge had reestablished its reputation and the youth finds that he had survived to triumph over his fear, he had been to touch the great death, found that after all it was but the great death. Crane originally wrote it. It was but the great death for others. This last phrase is significant. Most of the cuts he made in his manuscript are much less so. Crane's coolness about the youth, he is not unsympathetic, but he is hardly respectful, persists to the end. It is not the youth, but what happens to him that engrosses Crane. We identify with the youth only when the terror of battle becomes our own. We can see why Crane tended to toss off his novel as an experiment. This seeming trivialization of death was meant to be a shock effect in Crane's bantering style. But Crane, the novelist, did not have to say, as Crane, the poet, did, that war is man's fate. War is the great negative of freedom and hope. To Crane, any human being at war, anyone's possibilities mocked by war, had to become a decisive clinical experience. War, the red animal, the blood-swollen god, expresses the nature of our society and much still hidden in our souls. So that completes the introduction to the book, and so tomorrow we will continue to read The Red Badge of Courage. Thank you for listening. Good night, all.